Alex Martinez and Jack Chen had been inseparable since they were 7 years old, growing up in the small mining town of Copper Ridge, nestled at the base of the Cascadian Mountains. Now, at 23 years old, the two friends found themselves at a crossroads that neither had anticipated during their carefree childhood days. Alex came from a family of 5. His father had worked in the now-closed copper mine for 30 years before an accident left him with a permanent limp and a meager disability check. His mother cleaned houses in the wealthier neighborhoods 2 towns over, taking the bus at dawn and returning after dark. Alex had 2 younger sisters, Maria and Sophia, both still in high school, dreaming of college, dreams that seemed increasingly distant with each passing month. Jack's story was equally challenging. His parents had immigrated from Taiwan when he was 3, opening a small restaurant that barely survived the economic downturn 5 years ago. His father's health had deteriorated from the long hours and stress, and his mother now ran the restaurant alone, working 16-hour days. Jack was their only child, carrying the weight of their sacrifices and hopes on his shoulders. The two friends had graduated high school with decent grades and big dreams. Alex wanted to study engineering, inspired by his father's stories of building mine shafts and understanding the Earth's secrets. Jack dreamed of becoming a teacher, wanting to give back to communities like his own. But college tuition was a mountain too steep to climb without financial help, and student loans felt like trading one prison for another. Over the past 5 years, Alex and Jack had cycled through a dozen different jobs between them. Alex had worked as an office clerk at a logistics company, spending his days hunched over spreadsheets that blurred together into meaningless numbers. The fluorescent lights gave him headaches, and the monotony made him feel like he was slowly disappearing. He lasted 8 months before being laid off during budget cuts. Jack had tried his hand at driving delivery trucks for a regional shipping company. The pay was better than most options, but the isolation wore on him. Days spent alone on highways eating gas station food, sleeping in truck stop parking lots. It wasn't the life he'd envisioned. After a year, chronic back pain from the long hours behind the wheel forced him to quit. They'd worked construction jobs, waited tables, stocked shelves at the local supermarket, and even tried starting a landscaping business that failed after 3 months when their only equipment, a used lawnmower and a truck that was already on its last legs, finally gave out. Each failure chipped away at their confidence but somehow never quite broke their friendship or their determination. "My mom asked me again yesterday when I'm going back to school," Jack said one evening as they sat on the hood of Alex's beat-up Chevy, sharing a 6-pack of cheap beer and watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Alex took a long sip before responding. "Yeah. What did you tell her?" "Same thing I always do, soon. Maybe next semester. Maybe next year." Jack's voice cracked slightly. She just nodded and went back to chopping vegetables. She didn't say anything, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. "They don't understand it's not about wanting it badly enough," Alex said quietly. "My dad told me last week that if he could do it over, education would be his priority. He said it was the only real inheritance he could give me, and he felt like he'd failed." The weight of their parents' hopes sat between them, heavy as stone. But neither of them knew that in just a few days, everything would change. It was a crisp Saturday morning in late September when Alex called Jack at 7 in the morning. "I need to clear my head," Alex had said. "I got another rejection letter yesterday. The warehouse job I interviewed for 3 times. "Give me 20 minutes, Jack had replied without hesitation. They'd been hiking for about 2 hours, following a deer trail that led them deeper into the forest than they'd ever ventured before. The canopy overhead was so thick that the morning light filtered through in golden shafts, making the forest floor look almost magical. "Look at this," Jack said, stopping abruptly. He was pointing to a rock formation that seemed out of place, too angular, too deliberate to be entirely natural. As they investigated, pushing aside overgrown vines and brambles that caught on their clothes, they discovered an opening partially concealed by fallen branches and vegetation. The entrance was no more than 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, requiring them to crouch to peer inside. Cool air emanated from within, carrying an earthy, mineral scent that reminded Alex of his father's stories about the old mine shafts. "This looks man-made," Alex said, running his hand along the edge of the opening. The rock had been carved, smoothed by tools and time. Jack pulled out his phone to use the flashlight, but there was no signal this deep in the forest. "My instinct says this is a bad idea." Alex was already standing up, his face animated in a way Jack hadn't seen in months. "Come on, Jack. Maybe we'll find something that'll change our lives. When's the last time we did something spontaneous? Something that wasn't about job applications or bills or disappointing our families?" The words hung in the air. Jack looked at his best friend and saw the spark of the kid he'd built forts with, the teenager who'd convinced him to ask Sarah Chin to prom, the young man who'd sat with him in the hospital when his father had his first heart scare. That spark had been dimming lately, crushed under the weight of adult responsibilities and dashed hopes. "All right," Jack said finally. "But we do this smart. We go home, get proper supplies, tell someone where we're going." Alex's grin widened. "Deal." They returned 2 hours later, better prepared. Alex had brought his old camping gear, LED flashlights with extra batteries, a first aid kit, rope, protein bars, and bottles of water. Jack had added a compass, a roll of bright orange surveyor's tape to mark their path, and a whistle in case they got separated. They'd left a note on Alex's kitchen table, telling his mother they were exploring the old trails and would be back before dark. It wasn't entirely truthful, but they didn't want to worry anyone. Standing at the cave entrance again, they looked at each other one more time. "Last chance to back out," Jack said. "We're doing this," Alex replied and ducked into the opening. The first tunnel was narrow and low, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees for about 50 feet. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, and he had to consciously control his breathing to fight off the claustrophobia. Then, suddenly, the passage opened into a larger chamber tall enough for them to stand. "Whoa," they said in unison. Their flashlight beams revealed a cavern about the size of a basketball court. The walls were adorned with paintings that made both of them stop and stare. Handprints in red ochre, dozens of them overlapping across the stone. Pictures of animals, deer, bears, what might have been elk or moose. And human figures, dancing or hunting, frozen in time. "This is incredible," Jack whispered, his voice echoing slightly. "These paintings could be hundreds of years old. Maybe thousands." "Look at this," Alex called from across the chamber. He was kneeling beside what looked like a carefully arranged collection of objects. Human skulls, bleached white with age, were positioned in a circle. Inside the circle were cowrie shells, which seemed completely out of place this far from any ocean, and several clay pots, remarkably intact despite their obvious age. "This was a sacred place," Jack said, approaching carefully. "We should be respectful. These could be burial remains." Jack's eyes widened as he carefully examined a skull. "Dude, this is creepy. Let's be careful." They tied orange tape at the entrance to the chamber and ventured deeper. The cave system proved to be extensive, a maze of tunnels and chambers that wound through the mountain like a stone labyrinth. They marked their path carefully, tying tape every 50 feet or so, calling out to each other whenever the passage split to ensure they stayed together. "Whoa, this is amazing," Alex exclaimed as they discovered another chamber filled with more artifacts. This cave must have been used by ancient people. They'd been exploring for nearly 3 hours when they entered a chamber different from all the others. This one was smaller, more intimate. And in the center, sitting on a natural stone pedestal as if placed there deliberately, was a wooden box. The box was about 2 feet long, a foot wide, and a foot deep. Despite what must have been tremendous age, the wood was remarkably preserved. The dry cave air had protected it from rot. Intricate carvings covered its surface, symbols neither of them could decipher. They stood there for a long moment just staring at it. "Should we open it?" Jack asked nervously. "I mean, we've come this far," Alex replied. With trembling hands, Alex lifted the lid. It wasn't locked and the hinges, though ancient, still worked. Inside, nestled in what looked like decayed fabric, were objects that made both of them gasp. Gold. Nuggets of pure gold, ranging in size from peas to golf balls. But that wasn't all. There were other artifacts. More cowrie shells, small carved figures made of jade, and at the bottom, several pieces of worked gold. A bracelet, ceremonial arm rings, a small mask with haunting features. "We're rich," Alex shouted, holding up a gold nugget. His voice echoed through the chamber, seeming to bounce off the walls in strange, distorted ways. But even as Alex celebrated, Jack felt a growing sense of unease. "Alex, we should be careful. This feels like..." A deep rumbling sound cut him off. The ground beneath their feet trembled. "What was that?" Alex asked, his celebration dying instantly. "I don't know, but we need to go. Now." They quickly closed the box and Alex, unable to resist, grabbed 2 of the larger gold nuggets and stuffed them in his jacket pockets. "Just these," he said. "As proof." They turned to leave, but the rumbling grew louder. Dust began falling from the ceiling. Then, with a sound like thunder, part of the chamber ceiling collapsed, blocking the passage they'd entered through. "No, no, no!" Jack shouted, running to the collapsed section. Massive boulders now completely sealed the tunnel. They'd need excavation equipment to move them. There has to be another way out, Alex said, trying to keep the panic from his voice. We marked our path. We just need to find another route. But as they explored the remaining passages from the chamber, they realized they had no idea how to get back out. They had been so focused on exploring and then on the treasure, they hadn't tracked multiple escape routes. The orange tape they'd carefully placed led back to the now blocked passage. Okay, let's think about this logically, Jack said, though his voice shook. We came in from the east. We've been heading generally west and down. If we can find passages that lead up and east, we might find another exit. They tried, but the cave system was a labyrinth. Each passage seemed to lead deeper into the mountain rather than out. They found themselves in chambers they didn't recognize, following tunnels that dead-ended or looped back on themselves. Hours passed. Their water was running low. The protein bars tasted like sawdust in their dry mouths. The temperature continued to drop, and both of them were shivering in their light jackets. We're going to die in here, Jack whispered, his voice trembling. They'd been lost for over 4 hours now, and panic was setting in. Alex grabbed his friend's shoulder, squeezing hard. We can't give up, Jack. We have to keep moving. Our families are expecting us. Your mom needs you at the restaurant. My sisters need their big brother. I'm scared, Alex, Jack admitted, and there were tears in his eyes. Then we don't die, Alex said fiercely. We've been through too much together. We always get through it together. They kept moving, choosing passages more or less at random now, their systematic approach abandoned in favor of desperate searching. Their flashlights were dimming despite the extra batteries. They'd been underground for nearly 8 hours. Then Jack heard it, a sound so faint he thought he'd imagined it at first. Stop, he hissed. Listen. They stood perfectly still, barely breathing. There it was again, the sound of dripping water, but different from the countless drips they'd heard throughout the cave. This was rhythmic, echoing, like water hitting a large body of water. This way, Jack said, following the sound with renewed hope. They stumbled through a narrow passage, their shoulders scraping against the rock walls. Alex slipped on loose stones and fell hard, cutting his hand on a sharp rock. Blood welled up, dark in the beam of Jack's flashlight. Are you okay? Jack asked, helping him up. I'm fine, Alex said through gritted teeth, wrapping his hand in his shirt. Keep moving. The passage opened suddenly, and they found themselves in an enormous chamber. Before them, reflecting their lights like a mirror, was an underground lake that stretched into the darkness beyond the reach of their flashlight beams. It's huge, Jack breathed, momentarily forgetting their dire situation. Look, Alex said, pointing with his injured hand. At the edge of the water, pulled up on a small beach of smooth stones, was a boat. It was small, maybe 10 feet long, made of wood that somehow hadn't rotted despite the moisture. The craftsmanship was remarkable. The planks were carefully fitted, bound together with what looked like woven plant fibers coated in some kind of resin. 2 oars lay inside. That's impossible, Jack said. Who would bring a boat down here? Does it matter? Alex replied, his voice tight with pain and exhaustion. That's our only way out. Water flows somewhere. If we follow it, maybe it leads to the surface. Jack hesitated, looking at the dark water. What if it leads deeper into the mountain? What if there are waterfalls or rapids? What if the passage floods completely and there's no air? What if we sit here and die? Alex countered. Jack, that boat is our only chance. They examined the boat carefully. Despite its age, it seemed remarkably sound. They loaded their remaining supplies. One flashlight was completely dead now, and the other was flickering ominously. We have maybe an hour of light left, Jack said quietly. After that. Then we don't waste time, Alex said, pushing the boat into the water. The lake was deeper than it looked. Alex, using one of the oars to check the depth, couldn't touch bottom. The water was clear and cold, and in the beam of their dying flashlight, they could see strange rock formations beneath the surface. They paddled in silence at first, the only sounds the gentle splash of the oars and the steady drip of water from the cavern ceiling. Alex's injured hand made every stroke painful, but he didn't complain. Look at the walls, Alex said suddenly, his voice echoing strangely across the water. Jack turned his flashlight to where Alex was pointing. The cave walls were marked with more paintings, these ones more elaborate than any they'd seen before. They depicted a journey, people entering the cave, traveling through water, emerging into light. At the end of the sequence was a symbol that looked like the sun. It's a map, Jack said in wonder. They're showing the way out. We follow the paintings. Renewed hope gave them energy. They paddled faster, following the painted story on the walls. But then their flashlight gave a final flicker and died. Darkness. Complete, Absolute darkness like neither of them had ever experienced. It was so total that they couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. Jack. Alex's voice sounded small and terrified in the dark. I'm here, Jack replied, reaching out until his hand found Alex's shoulder. We're okay. We're still okay. How do we know which direction to paddle? The current, Jack said, forcing himself to think despite his pounding heart. Can you feel it? The water's moving slightly. We follow the current. They paddled slowly, carefully in the pitch black. Time lost all meaning. They couldn't see anything, couldn't tell if they'd been moving for minutes or hours. Alex's hand throbbed with each stroke of the oar, and he could feel blood seeping through the makeshift bandage. I need to rest, Alex said finally. My hand. Let me see, Jack said, reaching across the boat. He felt the wet fabric sticky with blood. It's still bleeding. We need to wrap it tighter. They used Jack's own shirt, tearing it into strips and binding Alex's hand properly. In the darkness, every sound was amplified, their breathing, the lap of water against the boat, the distant drip of water. Then Jack heard something else. Do you hear that? What? Alex asked. That sound, like rushing water. As they listened, the sound grew louder. The boat began moving faster. The current was strengthening. Oh God, Jack said. Rapids. There are rapids ahead. Hold on. Alex shouted. The boat suddenly accelerated, caught in a powerful current. They gripped the sides as they were flung through the darkness, unable to see what was ahead, unable to steer. Water splashed over the sides, soaking them. The boat crashed against rocks they couldn't see, spinning wildly. Alex was thrown from his seat, nearly falling overboard. Jack grabbed him by the jacket and pulled him back in. The boat hit something hard and there was a cracking sound. Water began seeping through the bottom. We're taking on water. Jack shouted over the roar of the rapids. There. Alex yelled. Do you see that? Ahead, barely visible, was the faintest gray light. Not sunlight but something. The promise of something other than absolute darkness. The boat shot through a narrow channel, scraping against the walls. More water poured in. They were sinking. Paddle. Alex screamed. Paddle for the light. They paddled with everything they had left, fighting the current, fighting the water filling the boat. Alex's injured hand screamed with pain, but he ignored it. Jack's arms burned with exhaustion, but he didn't stop. The light grew brighter. The passage opened up. And suddenly they were through. The boat emerged into a smaller chamber where dim light filtered through cracks in the ceiling far above. But the boat was sinking fast, already half full of water. We need to get to shore, Jack yelled. They paddled desperately for the nearest rocky beach. The boat was so low in the water now that every movement threatened to capsize it. They were 20 feet from shore when the boat finally gave up, the bottom splitting completely. They plunged into the freezing water. The cold was a shock so intense that both of them gasped, inhaling water. Jack went under, weighted down by his boots and clothes. He kicked hard, fighting for the surface, his lungs burning. He broke through, coughing and sputtering, and looked around wildly for Alex. Alex, he screamed. There. Alex's head broke the surface 10 feet away, but he was struggling. His injured hand couldn't help him swim, and he was going under again. Jack swam harder than he'd ever swum in his life, covering the distance in seconds. He grabbed Alex under the arms and kicked toward shore, fighting against the current that wanted to pull them back into the rapids. His feet touched bottom. He dragged Alex through the shallows and up onto the rocky beach, where they both collapsed, coughing up water, shaking with cold and exhaustion. Are you okay? Jack gasped when he could finally speak. Yeah, Alex coughed. Thanks to you. You saved my life. They lay there for several minutes, just breathing, grateful to be alive and on solid ground. The dim light from above was like a beacon of hope after the absolute darkness they'd endured. We need to keep moving, Jack said finally. We're soaked. If we don't find a way out soon, hypothermia will kill us. They stood on shaking legs and looked around. The light was coming from several places, cracks and fissures in the ceiling where daylight was seeping through. The chamber had multiple passages leading out, but one was different from the others. It sloped upward and more light came from that direction. There, Alex said, pointing. That's our way out. They started up the passage, slipping on wet rocks, their wet clothes clinging to them uncomfortably. Alex's hand had started bleeding again from the swim, leaving a trail of red drops on the stone. Every step was an effort, every breath hurt from the cold and exhaustion. The passage narrowed, then narrowed more. They were crawling again, squeezing through spaces barely wide enough for their bodies. Jack's claustrophobia returned with a vengeance, and he had to fight down panic as the walls pressed in on both sides. "I can't do this," he gasped, his breathing rapid and shallow. "It's too tight. I can't breathe." "Yes, you can," Alex said from behind him. "You saved my life in the water. Now I'm going to get you through this. Just keep moving. 1 inch at a time. Don't think about the walls. Think about your mom's cooking. Think about the first thing you're going to eat when we get out." Jack focused on Alex's voice, on the growing light ahead. The passage seemed to go on forever, squeezing tighter and tighter until he was certain they would get stuck. His shoulders scraped against rock on both sides. He couldn't turn his head. Then, suddenly, the passage opened. He tumbled forward into open air and light. Real light, sunlight that had never seemed so beautiful. He collapsed on the forest floor, gasping, and Alex tumbled out right behind him. They stumbled out of the cave, gasping for air. They looked at each other, and despite everything, the cold, the exhaustion, Alex's injured hand, their soaked clothes, they started laughing. Laughing like madmen, relief washing over them in waves. "We did it, Jack. We're alive," Alex exclaimed. Jack smiled through his tears of relief and exhaustion. "And we're alive. That's what matters." As they walked back to civilization, supporting each other, stumbling through the forest as the sun set, they couldn't stop talking about their adventure. The terror, the darkness, the rapids, the near drowning, it all seemed surreal now that they were safe. They knew they'd never forget their journey into the ancient cave, but more importantly, they'd never forget what they'd learned. That survival was more valuable than treasure, that friendship was the real fortune, and that sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from what you find, but from what you learn about yourself when everything seems lost. The walk back took 3 more hours. They emerged from the forest just as full darkness fell, hypothermic, exhausted, and more alive than they'd felt in years. They went straight to the hospital, where Alex's hand required 15 stitches and they were both treated for mild hypothermia and dehydration. The next morning, after they'd recovered enough to speak coherently, they went to the police station. They told their story, all of it, from the cave discovery to the collapse to their narrow escape. They showed them the 2 gold nuggets Alex had kept, still miraculously in his pocket. Within days their story was on the news. The cave system was one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in the region's history. The artifacts inside were linked to an indigenous population that had inhabited the area over 1,000 years ago. But the true treasure wasn't the gold. The state established a reward fund for their discovery and cooperation in preserving the site. It wasn't get-rich-quick money, but it was substantial, enough to change their lives. More importantly, the University of Washington reached out. They offered both Alex and Jack full scholarships to their undergraduate program, with guaranteed positions as research assistants on the cave excavation project. They could study what they loved while working with the site they'd discovered. At 23 years old, Alex and Jack finally got their fresh start. The cave had given them something more valuable than gold. It had given them purpose, opportunity, and a story that would define the rest of their lives. 2 years later, Alex was studying geological engineering, understanding the Earth's secrets his father had told him about. Jack was pursuing his education degree, focusing on indigenous studies and cultural preservation. The cave had been officially named the Twin Spirits Cave by the tribal council whose ancestors had used it centuries ago. Alex's father came to visit regularly, his eyes shining with pride. His sisters were both in college now. Jack's parents had hired help at the restaurant, finally able to work reasonable hours. On weekends, Alex and Jack still hiked together, though they were much more careful about cave exploration now. Alex's hand had healed, though it bore a scar he called his reminder. A reminder that survival is precious, that risk should be calculated, and that true wealth isn't measured in gold but in the people who pull you from the water when you're drowning. One evening, sitting outside the educational center built near the cave entrance, Jack turned to Alex. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we died in there? If we hadn't found the lake, or if the boat had sunk before we reached that chamber?" Alex was quiet for a moment. "Every day. But we didn't die. We survived. And I think that's the real story, not the gold we found but the strength we discovered in ourselves." "And in each other," Jack added. "And in each other," Alex agreed. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars appeared, the same stars that people had gazed at from this spot for thousands of years. They'd come from humble beginnings, struggled through darkness both literal and figurative, and emerged transformed. The cave had tested them in ways they'd never imagined. It had brought them to the edge of death and given them the chance to choose life. It had shown them that the real treasure was never the gold in the box. It was the courage to venture into the unknown, the strength to survive the darkness, and the bond between two friends who would never let each other go, no matter how deep the water or how tight the passage. Their journey was far from over. They still had dreams to pursue, challenges to face, and lives to build. But now they faced the future with confidence, knowing that whatever came next, they'd face it the same way they'd faced everything else, together with courage and with the knowledge that they'd already survived the worst the darkness could throw at them.